The culture of our workplace and our ministry teams has a significant impact on the health and effectiveness of our worship ministry. In this video, I interview William Vanderbloemen. He's the author of the book, Culture Wins, and he shares a ton of practical tips for building a healthy culture at your church. This video is brought to you by Lead Worship with Ableton, a free training to help you get started with the #1 worship leading software. With Ableton Live, you can run a click, backing tracks, and automate lyrics and lighting. It's the best tool for increasing excellence and eliminating distracting mistakes in worship. Click the link in the description to enroll in the free training today. My name is Jake Goslin with churchfront.com, an online resource for innovative and creative church leaders. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can receive all of our latest content to help you grow yourself and grow your church. And make sure you also check out the show notes below this video for some free tools and resources for your worship ministry. It didn't take me long working at a church to realize how important culture is in the church workplace as well as within our ministries. Because culture is that unspoken, sort of subconscious way we go about working together, whether we're on a staff at a church or we're working with our volunteers who are part of our worship and production ministries. Maybe you have a culture of excellence where people know they need to put in the effort to get things done and do them well and do them right, and they're excited and passionate. Or maybe you have a more apathetic culture at your church where people kind of show up and things are last minute and done haphazardly. No matter what, your church has a culture, and hopefully if you are a healthy leader, you are pursuing a healthy culture for your organization. So that's why I'm excited to share with you this interview with William Vanderbloemen. He's the founder of the Vanderbloemen Search Group that helps staff the church. And he's going to share with you some helpful insight on building a healthy culture at your church, both on the staff level as well as within your worship ministry. Since this is a long-form interview, I've included links to the podcast session if you just want to listen to this interview on the go. And I've also included some quick navigation links below this video to skip to the different topics we cover. So without further ado, here's my interview with William Vanderbloemen. William Vanderbloemen, welcome to the Churchfront Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Jake. I really appreciate being on here.
Hey, to get us started, can you just go ahead and share with us what you do at Vanderbloemen Search Group, just so folks get an idea of who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, well, we do a podcast. It's audio because I have a face that's made for audio, but good to be on your YouTube as well as the normal podcast. We are a company that helps churches find great staff people. That's kind of the backbone of our business. Churches hire us to find their pastor or a worship pastor or a creative or a tech director, lots of different things, usually just full-time positions. And then also, we have faith-based colleges and relief organizations and pretty much anything that's driven by faith, even for-profit businesses, will call us because they want us to find somebody that matches their DNA and their core values and their culture. And then they trust us to figure the competencies out.
That's awesome. So why, maybe a little bit of the backstory, why did you start a search group for churches?
Because churches love new ideas.
Yeah, right.
I was a pastor for about 15 years, mostly as a lead pastor, and lead pastor of churches of lots of different sizes, 150 to the last one I served was about 5,000 adults and a couple thousand kids, and school and multi-venue and all that. Like I did robes. We didn't do smells and bells, but it was full-on Aeolian Skinner organs that are super special, and then would take the robe off and go over and do the other venue, which was more like what you would expect at North Point or something like that. So did that, went through a divorce, which I would not recommend. Wasn't like a tabloid-worthy thing, but a tragic thing. And that led me, I was a single dad, had 4 kids, to go into the corporate world here in Houston. And while I was in that corporate setting, I was at a Fortune 200 company, and they had a CEO who'd been there 9 years, which at that size company, that is a long, long time for a CEO to be there. And they did his succession in about 90 days. They'd hired a new CEO. Now, 10 years later, that guy's still there. So they've gone 19 years with zero interruption, completely seamless. The last church I served, First Presbyterian Houston, big church, very reputable. I mean, it's kind of a brass ring sort of thing. They took almost 3 years to find me. I was there not quite 6 years. And then they took 2.5 years to find my successor. And that's a good church. So you got 11 years, half with a pastor, half without. And I thought, this is insane. So Adrian and I had just gotten married, and I came home. We were a blended family. We had 6 kids in our house. We just bought a house. And I said, baby, I think I'm supposed to quit my job and start something new for churches. And so she looked at me and said what I just said. She said, that's because churches love new ideas, right? And so, but she actually said, let's try it. And that's when I knew, this is either a really good or really bad idea, but worth a try. And off we went in 2008.
Well, I really admire what you've built over the past 10 years now, almost then. As someone else who's also like Churchfront is a business that is in the business of serving the church, I definitely run into the churches, the sarcasm of churches love new ideas once in a while. I've experienced that myself, but it is really exciting to see just the success of Vanderbloemen and how many, more importantly, just because of you guys are helping so many people with such an important task that as someone who's worked in the church, I've been in part-time roles and full-time roles. Now I'm part-time worship leader at a church plant here alongside doing what I do at Churchfront. But I've tasted the issues that come up with putting the right people on the right bus, and also hopefully fostering a healthy culture on that bus too. So, and that's what I'm really excited to pick your brain about today. You just released a book a few months ago called Culture Wins, The Roadmap to an Irresistible Workplace. And in 2015, you guys, Vanderbloemen Search Group was ranked number 1 by Entrepreneur, the secular media outlet about business, as number 1 in their list of the smaller companies with amazing culture. So that was really exciting, really awesome and exciting to see. So you have the book on it. Your company itself lives it out, just what it looks like to have a irresistible, healthy culture. I actually I'm acquaintances with Rusty Gates, I believe. He's on your team because he went to Denver Seminary here, so he was in the same scholarship cohort I was in a few years ago. But everything I see about your workplace, like lots of great stuff going on there. So having you on the Churchfront podcast with our listeners being worship leaders and a lot of folks who are working at churches, maybe not even staff positions, kind of all over the board. I think it's still important for us to understand culture and the importance of culture and why, in the end, culture wins. So whether you're a paid staff member at a church, you're leading a whole department or the whole church, or you are leading a ministry of volunteers, I wanted to pick your brain just with a few questions to help us understand the importance of culture and then how we can hopefully put some action into arriving at a place of a healthy and irresistible culture in our churches. So my first question is, what is culture? It's kind of a buzzword I think we hear a lot. It's not really defined very well. So what is culture and why does it matter for churches and ministries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the word is meaning different things than it used to mean. There's a part of the book where we talk about having someone on staff that part of their job is to make sure culture gets driven through the workplace. And we titled that person on our staff the culture whip, like the Senate majority whip. And we were actually going to title the book that, like the culture whip, right? And we ran it by some test groups, and there was a sector of the population that said, is that like some probiotic yogurt dessert sort of thing?
You never know these days.
So, right. So is it, culture in the workplace, not the yogurt world? Culture, if vision is what we're trying to get done, culture is the how we behave while we're doing it. It's the how we work together. Mm-hmm. And they're long definitions, but it's basically the spoken and unspoken customs that just kind of get passed on from one generation to the next without even thinking about it. that's not how we do things around here. Well, that's talking about culture, for good or bad. So, what we found, we kind of built from the ground up and sort of fell into some good practices that we just got lucky with. We did some things wrong too, but what we found was in building that culture from the ground up, if you really focus on saying, how do we want to behave while we're doing what we're doing? And how do we find people that are like that on the front end? You can build a team where people like coming to work because they like the way things get done. And that's really, really strange because 2 out of 3 Americans hate their job. Not mildly dislike or, boy, I'm glad hump day's here or TGIF. Like, they hate it. And I think if you look down the road with the coming of a workforce that really will be dominated by millennials, and that's a group that has been able to change channels among thousands of TV channels, not 3 networks. And if they don't like their job or they hate their job, they're just going to leave it. So I think businesses and churches that will focus on building an irresistible workplace will have a real advantage, even if they just keep people a year or 2 longer than they would have otherwise.
Yeah, and this topic hits home for me just because my full-time position I had a couple of years ago, it wasn't and the reason I left it, part of it's because I'm kind of an entrepreneurial guy and I decided it's like, I want to go do my own thing. But the other aspect of it was really a culture issue where I loved the day-to-day tasks of my job of leading worship and heading up communication and just all the creative stuff that goes on with that. But when it came to working like the staff culture and working with folks there, it was not a good situation. And I learned a lot through it. I mean, I kind of learned about areas that I could grow in. But ultimately in this particular church, there was 4 of us young guys who were younger than 40 years old who had just been hired in a 2-year span at this church. And this is like an older mainline church. You guys probably see this a lot. They need to go to hire Vanderbloemen for some help. Anyways, and the 4 of us who got hired between 2015 and 2016, now all 4 of us are gone. My best friend, who's still the youth pastor, he's going to be done at the end of the month at this church because it's all culture issues. And eventually we're all pretty high energy, high achieving guys. We love ministry, and it just wasn't a good fit. So that's kind of part of my story and like why this stuff really hits home for me. And now as I'm like working on building something with Churchfront and then also in my ministries, I'm like, man, I want to make a place or be able to build an organization that attracts, folks who like want to be there. And it's like, it's irresistible. It's a great word for it. So I guess I have a couple questions from a couple different perspectives. So from the perspective of a employee at a church, I guess you could say someone who's working part-time or full-time at a church, what can he or she do to help contribute to like a healthy staff culture, or at least be part of, making it better, solving the problem rather than making things worse? Because I know a lot of the book is definitely geared toward people in like maybe in leadership positions where they're the ones really, because ultimately that's what leaders do. They're the ones who kind of help really set the tone for this stuff. But since so many folks listening to this aren't necessarily lead pastors or associate pastors, they're worship pastors, how can they help first contribute to a healthier culture to the church and staff culture there? And then after, we can maybe talk more about their own ministries that they're overseeing.
Sure. Yeah. Great question. And, when you write a book, you write to a person, right? You pick up like when you write a song, right? You're writing out of your own pain or you're writing out of your own whatever it is, but it's pointed toward one thing. So when you write a book, one of the first things you should do is say, who is this book for? And let's write toward them. And then maybe you have a secondary person. So for us, the primary audience of the book is the millennial at work who has the ear of the senior leader. And that's probably a lot of your listeners, you know? So it's read this book and then just take it to your boss and say, this was a good read. It doesn't take long. We did not write it like a big, long textbook. It's not a hard read. read the story of this company and some of the research they've done, and let me know how I can help you as we try to improve the place that we already are. And I think having sat in the lead chair as a lead pastor, I was fine with people who wanted to give help, but it's a very, I say this carefully, it's a very lonely seat. And you spend your Monday combing through emails of people wondering why you read from this translation instead of that one, and why you wore this shirt instead of that one. And you got people coming at you all the time. So when staff come at you and say, let me tell you how things ought to be around here, it never is going to go well. And that's not because you have some weirdo senior pastor. That's just their reality in their life, right? But when someone came to me and said, I love working here, I love being here, and I read this book and I thought, man, this might be something that's helpful. If I can help you with any of this, go for it. So that would be one way that you could very tangibly talk to your boss. And it varies from culture to culture, right? I mean, you've got some churches that are a very high honor culture, and it's a little harder to have that conversation. You've got others where maybe there's a big generational gap, and that presents its own challenges. So I would say whatever you can do to get inside the head of your lead pastor before you have that conversation or take things to them, and just think, what are their pain points and how do I anticipate that? And how do I honor them? Because it's a lonely chair. And when you find someone who you can trust that'll help you, you'll work with them all day long. Another quick way, in the book, we have kind of two sections. One is, how do you build a culture that's just healthy, irrespective of what your particular culture is? Like, what are the baseline principles for health? We studied about 150 companies that won awards and realized that by our read, there are about 8 key sections of company health. And rather than make everybody buy a book, we had our digital team put together a free online tool. And it's theculturetool.com. So you can go to theculturetool.com, and there's a free assessment there. You can take it as an individual, and it'll show you how you feel about your workplace. You can have your worship team go through it together so that they can say, here's how the worship team feels. And if you have the good enough relationship with your senior pastor, you could take to them and say, let's put the whole staff through this. And it'll show us how we're doing in the 8 key areas of health or toxicity. It's things like communication, innovation. It's not anything that should threaten people too much. Mm-hmm. We've had, gosh, I don't even want to know how many companies go through this, not just churches. So we've got a baseline on how others have scored. It'll show you how you score against that. And I think that's a great way to start a conversation about what are some simple things we can do to lean into the places that we're really strong and to shore up the places that we're not. So that's probably more than you wanted to hear, but there you go.
No, that's fantastic. And I'll link the culture tool below the video or in the podcast description too, so you can go download it there as well. So let's talk a little bit now about from the perspective of, okay, I'm a worship leader and maybe I'm just a volunteer worship leader or I'm leading a tech ministry at a church. How can I really develop a healthy culture, irresistible culture for volunteers? Like, especially folks because in a sense, even in my little ministry department, it's almost like a little mini business with like people in different roles. So like, how do you translate, or what are some practical things that you've seen done well in that sort of context? And maybe these are principles that apply to all departments and churches, but maybe if you've seen anything specifically for worship leaders, what might that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jake. I think that, first of all, the book was written primarily thinking about staff. Okay, so the culture within a staff. And, churches have core values and cultural values, but I'm talking about how, staff can talk to each other in a way that you're just not going to every single member of the church. Not because we're above anybody. I'm a big believer in the priesthood of all believers. It's just, we're working inside the sausage factory, and not everybody wants to see all that goes on there, right? If you're I would say before you start making sweeping changes to your volunteer culture, you got to ask yourself, what is our volunteers setup like? I mean, are we just really trying to find people? And man, if I could get 10 more volunteers, I don't care. If they can put fog on a mirror, then they're the volunteer. That's the way one of the churches I attended growing up, the sound tech at First Baptist Church in Lenore wore 2 hearing aids that didn't work. So, like he was about 150 years old, and nice guy, and nobody would say, hey, Howard, you can't hear. You probably shouldn't be the sound engineer. So if that's your culture, then that's a whole different set of problems. But if you're in what I would call a healthier volunteer setting, where you're actively recruiting people based on their talent or their ability to recruit and retain others, well, then I think it's wise to start thinking about those volunteers as if they were employees. And I don't mean that in I'm the boss, you're the employee. I mean you interview them like crazy before you give them responsibility. You do reviews with them like crazy, as if they're on your payroll. You treat their time that they're giving you in the same respect that you would treat somebody who comes in to work for you. And you treat the culture that you're building with the same respect. Maybe you put them through the culture tool to get a baseline, and then maybe you walk through a process of figuring out what is our particular culture. Because outside that baseline healthy culture, there's another thing that goes on with teams, because teams are made up of people. And I'm becoming convinced that nearly every team is led by broken people. It's kind of like the reason Jesus had to come. So for me, figuring out our culture at our company is not what do we want to be on our very best day. It's what are the things that we do that are common to us, but uncommon to other teams around us. Like when we're functioning as our best as a tech team or a worship team, what do we do as a team that is normal for us and abnormal in other teams around us? You start to ask that question, you'll start to unlock what your culture is. And the book outlines a process for doing that. But that one question can really begin a very rich conversation, and one that comes from the ground up, and not just, I went to the mountain and I came back with these cultural values, and so here they are.
Incredibly helpful. And one more question for you is, a lot of the listeners of this podcast are in the millennial generation. Whenever I look at my demographics, like on YouTube and such, it's between ages, 18 and 35 or something like that. So they're kind of early in their vocation and careers and getting started, and especially if they want to, go full time in church ministry. One important thing, again, I kind of shared my story earlier, and I've learned it now, because I think culture is worth way more than any other form of compensation, a lot of the times. But what advice do you have for worship leaders who are searching for a position? Maybe they're browsing job boards, and they're looking for a spot to work and get started with their career. How can they be careful about finding the right culture? Maybe what are some like red flags to avoid, and how to kind of discern what's a good fit for them or not?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. If you're talking about people who are thinking about that first job, most of the time you're talking about people who are going to be looking locally. And so I would say worship at the church a whole lot. What you want to do is get past all the cool statements about how cool it is to work here. Like, church job searching can be a whole lot like bad high school dating, where, she doesn't eat for 5 days before the date so she can wear something she should never wear. And he like waxes his car like his car's ever clean, and lifts weights 5 minutes before he picks her up so he looks all bulked up. And it ain't that way, And so when we do a search, I tell people, my job is to make sure you don't walk down the aisle with Rachel and wake up next to Leah. Let's just be real. So if you're in a local search, you can figure out what's real if you attend enough times. If you're in a national search, you've just got to develop some skill in determining what are they on their best day and their worst day, and is that a place where I can do my life? And there is no perfect church place. I would say they can go to our website. It's vanderbloemen.com. And honestly, you can misspell that into Google 1,000 different ways. It'll get you back to Vanderbloemen. It's why we named the company what we did. And there are like 2,500 free resources there that should guide people in, like, how do I interview? How do I tell what's real? All those kind of questions.
Yeah, I think yourself and Carrie Newhoff are in competition for like what's the most misspelled last name. Every time, especially Carrie's last name. Every time I search, I'm like, I can never remember how to spell his name. But you're right. It helps with Google search. But and those are great tips.
If you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. That's all. Carrie and I are both Dutch.
Oh, okay. That was actually my follow-up question. What's the heritage? So Dutch. Great. Good to know. Well, thank you so much, William, for your time and sharing your insight on this topic. And I just want to encourage all the listeners to go on Amazon, find Culture Wins. Just download it, buy it today. You won't regret it. And like you said earlier, if you're in a position where you have the ear of the senior pastor, have a relationship with them, and then, suggest, that they check out the book as well if you find it helpful. So thank you so much, William. Appreciate what you're up to and what Vanderbloemen is doing to help worship leaders find the right spot.
Thanks a bunch, Jake. Appreciate you having me on.
I hope you enjoyed that interview and you are able to take away as much helpful info as I did. I'd love being able to ask him these questions, and he is an expert on the workplace and building a healthy culture. And a lot of these principles we can apply to our worship ministries. I've included a link below this video to his book, Culture Wins, so make sure you pick up a copy and read it yourself. Share it with the other leaders at your church as well. And I want to encourage you, if you're a worship leader, sign up for my free training, Lead Worship with Ableton. It's going to teach you how to get started with the #1 worship leading software. It's going to drastically increase the musical and production quality of your worship gathering. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, hit that thumbs up button, share it with your friends in ministry, and you can check out some related videos over here. And don't forget to subscribe to the Churchfront channel so you can continue to receive all of our latest content to help you grow yourself and grow your church.